Today is the first video in a little mini series that I'm going to be calling Overexposure versus Underexposure. We're going to take a look at some film stocks that I like to shoot and also some that I've never shot before but are planning to shoot in the future, and see just how much the film can be over or underexposed and whether it provides a look that I particularly like. Today, we're going to start it off by shooting some Portra 160. For this test, I shot one roll of Portra 160 through my Pentax 6.7, which is actually a brand new camera to me, and I'll have a small first impressions video coming soon on that. So this is the 120 format version of Portra 160. I'll most likely do all of these tests with the 120 version of the film, unless I'm testing out a 35mm exclusive film like Kodak Color Plus. The image that I used for this test was a simple composition of my conservatory, and I wanted to use this because it had some incredibly harsh lighting and very contrasty scene with the sun shining into the conservatory and creating some very bright highlights and some very deep shadows. In reality, I'd want to shoot a lot of my photos in softer light and later in the day sort of thing, when the sun is lower and the shadows are less dark, but I felt that it did make a pretty good test anyways, and it meant that in the future I should be able to replicate this fairly easily to compare different film stocks. I metered using my instant meter as well as a small spot meter app on my iPhone. This is how I tend to meter for all of my photography, and I wanted to keep that sense of a normal process of metering that I personally do, so that this test was more relevant to me and understanding how I want to expose Portra 160 going forwards. If you expose in a completely different way, the results should still transfer to your work. I did rate the Portra 160 at box speed, which I wouldn't also normally do. I'd probably rate it at 100 or 80 as the base exposure, so I'm maybe a half a stop underexposed as to what I would normally call my base exposure, but for this series I wanted to go off of the manufacturer recommendations as to what to rate the film at. I'm going to show you all of the images now, completely unedited, how I received them from the lab, one by one, and then comparing all of the different exposures to the base correct exposure that I metered for. As you can see, there is a vast difference between overexposing Portra 160 and underexposing Portra 160. It's well known that generally all negative film handles overexposure far better than it does underexposure, and these tests just completely prove that to be true. This is largely in part to how film works, and in particular the density of a film negative. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but essentially a negative is able to hold a lot of information in the denser areas of the film, and that's why an inverted negative is much better at highlight retention than retaining details in the shadows. There's an amazing video on film density and exposing film by one of my favorite YouTubers, Cody Mitchell, so if you want to know more on this, I'll leave a link down in the description to that, as he describes it far better than I ever could. As for my negatives, the unedited images showed that overexposure clearly handles incredibly bright highlights better than underexposure handles the darker shadows. At one stop overexposed, the images look incredibly similar. There's a very minimal color shift. It's a tiny bit cooler, particularly in the shadows, but there is quite a lot more detail in the shadows, of course, which may be your preferred look. The highlights outside also look a little bit cooler and obviously slightly brighter as it is that one stop more exposed, but there there is still plenty of information in there to be worked with. At 2 stops overexposed, again, we don't see a huge difference between this and the base exposure. The highlights are starting to get close to clipping now and losing information, and they do have a much colder hue to them than the base exposure, which is particularly noticeable in the greens outside, which have shifted to a slightly bluer cyan green. But of course you do get even more detail in the shadows, and so much less pronounced grain down there. At 3 stops overexposed, this does now start to shift very blue, particularly in the highlights. The outside area of the image is very cold now, and the shadows inside have also started shifting a little more considerably blue. The shadow areas that I originally had as quite deep and dark shadows in my base exposure are now slowly getting up closer to a middle grey range. And at 4 stops overexposed, the image has taken on a very different colour cast, much bluer and cooler again, particularly outside in the highlights. But there is still data in those highlights. It's not completely blown out still at 4 stops overexposed, which is really quite impressive. So it does still provide a usable image from which you can work with and edit. Underexposure, however, tells a very different story. At 1 stop underexposed, the colour shift isn't actually too bad, but the shadows have begun to already get quite muddy quite quickly, and it gives the image this overall sort of brown tone and look to it. At 2 stops underexposed, the image just quite quickly starts falling apart. It's incredibly contrasty and grungy. At this point, you're starting to lose some shadow detail in areas like on the chair and under the table. At 3 stops underexposed, the image is now incredibly dark. Because Portra 160 is a low ISO film, the shadows do actually tend to stay fairly clean. There's not a whole lot of noise that is really distracting and gross to look at, but they are rapidly losing detail and shifting quite severely in colour. You can see that the highlights are obviously doing just fine and actually stay quite nice and bright, almost similar to the base exposure, but the rest of the image has shifted very heavily down into the shadows and the blacks of the image, rendering it a much more contrasty final look. And finally, at 4 stops underexposed, we have an incredibly contrasty image with a lot of shadows and pure black parts where there is little to no detail at all. It looks very different from the base correct exposure, and unless you're purposefully going for a very grungy and contrasty image, I wouldn't personally recommend shooting 4 stops underexposed at any point. Shoot the correct exposure and edit to get that contrasty and grungy look rather than the other way around. Now, I did do a very simple edit of these photos to try and get them looking closer to the base exposure. I didn't play around too much, so they're definitely not perfect, but as you'd expect, it is easier to edit an overexposed negative to get closer to the correct exposure that I metered for than it is to edit an underexposed negative. So in conclusion, I definitely think it's clear to see that erring on the side of overexposure when it comes to Portra 160 is definitely preferable to risking underexposure. I really like the base exposure that is technically correct for the metered scene, but I do think that when I'm shooting Portra 160 in the future, I'll most likely meter to overexpose the negative by 1 stop, as there was very minimal color shift that wasn't particularly noticeable. There was a lot of extra detail in the shadow portions whilst retaining detail in the brightest highlights, and I found that the easiest to edit to the point that I wanted it to be. And if you're going to shoot Portra 160 for the first time, that would probably be my recommendation to you. Overexpose by 1 stop, and you can do that by simply metering at ISO 80 instead of 160. Let me know your thoughts on this little comparison down below, or if you have any tips on shooting Portra 160, please do share them. If you liked the video, feel free to give it a like and hit that subscribe button if you do want to see any more of my content in the future. Stay safe everyone, stay happy, and I'll see you in the next one.